The place card had my name on it, Theodore Marsh, written in my daughter-in-law's neat, looping hand, and under my name, in smaller letters, a number, Table 9. I stood in the doorway of the Fairmont Grand Ballroom on the evening of my 50th wedding anniversary, holding that card between two fingers, and I looked out across a room of 240 people. Crystal, white linen, my late wife's favorite lilies on every centerpiece. Tables 1 through 8, arranged in a wide horseshoe around a raised head table, where a banner hung with my name and Helen's name spelled out in gold, and Table 9 was in the far back corner, past the service doors, where they had seated the children. 7 kids under the age of 11, paper cups, a booster seat. My son Marcus walked up beside me, put a hand on my shoulder, and said, "It's not a big deal, Dad. We ran out of room." I looked at the 8 empty chairs at the head table, under my own name, and I said nothing at all. Before I tell you what happened over the next 4 hours in that ballroom, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from right now. I read every single one. And if you believe a man should never have to ask permission to sit at his own table, hit that like button and subscribe. To understand how I ended up holding a place card for the children's table at my own 50th anniversary, you have to go back 19 months, to the morning my wife died. My name is Theodore Marsh. I am 71 years old. For 38 years I worked as a forensic structural engineer, which is a long way of saying that when a building fell down, when a bridge cracked, when a parking garage collapsed onto 40 cars in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, I was the man they called to figure out why. That was my entire career. Failure analysis. I did not build things. I studied the things that broke, and I traced the break backward, hairline crack by hairline crack, until I found the exact place where it started. Here is the thing about structural failure that most people do not understand. A building almost never falls down because of the thing that happened on the day it fell down. The earthquake, the flood, the truck that hit the support column. That is just the final load. The building fell down because 11 years earlier, somebody used the wrong grade of rebar in a footing, and nobody looked, and nobody checked. And every year after that, the crack grew by a millimeter that nobody measured. By the time it comes down, the collapse is old news. The collapse started years ago. Everyone just called it fine. I testified in 142 cases over my career. I have sat in federal court and explained to juries how a stress fracture propagates. I have been cross-examined by attorneys who were paid $900 an hour to make me look like a fool, and I have never once raised my voice at any of them. You do not win by raising your voice. You win by being right, and by being patient, and by having documentation that cannot be argued with. My wife's name was Helen. We were married on the 14th of June, 1975, in a Methodist church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, with 41 people in attendance, and a reception in the church basement that cost my father $180. Helen was a music teacher, 41 years in the public schools of Marion County. She taught somewhere around 4,000 children to read music. And I know that number because in her last summer she sat down with a legal pad and tried to count them all. She got as far as 1988 before her hands got too tired to keep writing. She was the warm one. I was the quiet one. That was the arrangement. And it worked. And for 50 years, I never once had to wonder whether I was loved. We had 2 children. Marcus was born in 1979. He is a man of enormous charm, and I mean that word precisely, the kind of charm that fills a room and empties a bank account. He sells commercial real estate. He has sold commercial real estate for 22 years, and in that time he has been, alternately, a millionaire on paper and 3 months behind on his mortgage, sometimes in the same fiscal quarter. Claire was born in 1983. Claire is a pediatric nurse. Claire is the one who called me every Sunday at 4 in the afternoon for 11 years, without exception, and who never once asked me for money. I am telling you this now, at the beginning, so you understand. I did not have two bad children. I had one child who broke, and one child who held. Helen was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer on the 9th of March. She died on the 2nd of December, at 4:50 in the morning, in a hospice bed we had set up in the front room where the piano used to be. Marcus was not there. He had told me he was flying back from a closing in Charlotte. He arrived 11 hours later, in a black suit, and he cried harder than anyone in the room, and several people commented afterward on how devastated he was. Claire was there. Claire had been there for 19 days straight. She slept in a recliner. She learned to run the morphine pump. She was holding her mother's left hand at 4:50 in the morning, and I was holding the right, and neither of us said a word for about 20 minutes afterward, because there was nothing that needed saying. That is who was in the room. I want you to remember that, because it becomes important. Helen and I had assets, not extraordinary ones, but we were savers. We were the kind of people who drove a car for 14 years and who did not take a vacation that we had not budgeted for 18 months in advance. At the time of her death, the estate consisted of the house on Delaware Street, which was paid off and appraised at $485,000, my pension and Social Security, which came to about $9,100 a month, an investment account holding $1.4 million, built over 40 years of putting away whatever we could into low-cost index funds, and never, ever touching it. And one more thing, the reason any of this happened, in 1996, I designed and patented a load path anchor bracket for high-wind curtain wall assemblies. It is a piece of steel about the size of your hand. It is not glamorous, but it is very good, and it is cheap to manufacture. And for 29 years, a company in Cleveland has been licensing it and sending me a royalty check. That bracket paid for both my children's college. It paid off the house. And when construction boomed in the Gulf states after the hurricanes, that little piece of steel started paying me somewhere between $240,000 and $310,000 a year. The patent had, at the time of Helen's death, roughly 9 years of enforceable life remaining, and an acquisition firm had already made an unsolicited offer to buy the licensing rights outright, $2.6 million. I had not accepted. I had not declined. I had told them I would think about it after the funeral. And then I had put the letter in the drawer of my desk and had not thought about it at all, because my wife was dead and I did not care about a piece of steel. Marcus knew about the offer. He knew because he was standing in my study on the day of the funeral, holding a glass of my scotch, when the estate attorney mentioned it in passing. I saw my son's face when he heard the number. I saw it, and I filed it away, and I did not think about it again for 4 months. That was my mistake. That was the wrong grade of rebar in the footing, and I looked directly at it, and I called it fine. Marcus is married to a woman named Priscilla. Priscilla is 52. She runs an interior design business that has, as far as I have ever been able to determine, exactly one client, and that client is Priscilla. She has a very particular way of speaking to people she considers beneath her, which is a category that includes waiters, contractors, her own mother, and me. She was not unkind to Helen. I want to be fair. She came to the hospital twice. She brought flowers that Helen was allergic to, and she stayed for 40 minutes each time, and she posted a photograph of herself holding Helen's hand with a caption about strength and family. Helen, who could barely lift her head at that point, looked at me after Priscilla left the second time and said, "Teddy, that woman is a load-bearing wall in a house she did not build." My wife had a way of putting things. The first crack appeared in April, 4 months after the funeral. Marcus came to the house on a Tuesday. He brought coffee. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, where Helen and I had eaten 40 years of breakfasts, and he told me that he was worried about me. "You're rattling around in this house alone, Dad," he said, his voice soft and full of concern. "It's too much house. It's a lot of stairs." I said the stairs were fine. "You fell in November," he said. I had not fallen. I had knelt down to pick up a dropped pen, and my knee had locked, and I had held onto the counter and stood back up. Claire had been there. She had laughed at me. I had laughed at myself. But somewhere between that kitchen and my son's mouth, kneeling had become falling. I did not correct him. That was a choice. I want to be honest about that. 38 years of failure analysis teaches you something that I have never been able to explain properly to anyone. When you find the first crack, you do not fix it. Not immediately. You mark it. You photograph it. You measure it. And then you come back in 90 days and you measure it again. Because a crack that is not growing is a scar, and a crack that is growing is a countdown. You cannot know which one you have from a single look. So I did not correct him. I let him believe I had fallen. And I started measuring. Over the next several months, my son visited more often than he had in the previous decade. He was attentive. He was warm. He brought Priscilla, who touched my arm, and asked about my sleep in a voice pitched slightly too loud, the way people speak to the very old and the slightly deaf. I am neither. My hearing is excellent. It has always been excellent. That becomes relevant. They talked, gently and constantly, about simplification. Simplify. That was the word. Not sell, not sign. Simplify. Simplify the house. Simplify the accounts. Simplify the patent. Which was, Marcus explained to me, a real management burden. And wouldn't it be so much easier if someone handled the licensing paperwork for me? He offered to be that someone. Purely administrative. Purely to help. I said I would think about it. I thought about it a great deal. In June, Marcus brought me a document. It was 7 pages. It was titled, in a large friendly font, Family Care and Estate Simplification Agreement. He handed it to me across the kitchen table, with a pen already uncapped, and he said, "It's mostly boilerplate, Dad. Frank's assistant drafted it. Frank Delgado has been my attorney for 26 years. I have his cell phone number. I have had dinner at his home." I looked at the document for approximately 90 seconds. The first 4 pages were exactly what he said. Powers of attorney for medical decisions. A healthcare directive. Ordinary things. Things a man of 71 ought to have in place. And things Frank had, in fact, already put in place for me in 2019. Page 5 was a durable financial power of attorney. Unlimited. Effective immediately, rather than upon incapacity. Page 6 assigned management and negotiation authority over all intellectual property held by the signer to Marcus Theodore Marsh, including, but not limited to, the right to enter into binding sale or licensing agreements. Page 7 was a signature line. I sat with that document in my hands, at my wife's kitchen table, and I felt the thing I have felt maybe 6 times in my life. Not rage, something colder and much more useful. It is the feeling I got in a parking structure in Sacramento in 1998, when I put my hand on a column and understood, before I had a single measurement, that 40,000 tons of concrete were being held up by something that had already failed. Everything goes very quiet, and you think, all right, show me. I looked up at my son, and I made my face confused. I want to be very precise about what I did, because it is the hinge on which all of this turns. I did not accuse him. I did not throw the document. I did not call Frank Delgado in front of him and ask why his assistant had drafted a document assigning away my patent rights. I squinted at page 6. I held it a little closer. I moved my lips slightly, the way a man does when the letters are not quite cooperating, and I said, "Marcus, this print is awfully small," and I watched my son's face relax. That is the moment. Right there. That is the moment I want you to hold on to. Because everything that happened over the next 14 months happened because of the way my son's shoulders dropped when he decided I was slower than I used to be. He said, "Don't worry about the details, Dad. I'll walk you through it." I said, "I got tired in the afternoons." I said, "Maybe we could look at it another day." He said, Of course, Dad. No rush." He left the document on my table. He kissed the top of my head, which he had never done in his life, and he left. I sat alone in that kitchen for a long time. Then I got up, and I went to my study, and I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, where I keep the tools of my old trade: a caliper, a crack-width comparator card, 211 case files, and a habit, built over 38 years and never once broken, of writing down what I observed on the day I observed it. I took out a fresh legal pad. At the top, I wrote the date, and underneath I wrote, "Subject appears to believe I did not read page 6. Then I wrote, "Do not correct him." There is a discipline in my old profession called instrumentation. When you suspect a structure is failing, you do not tear it open. You do not evacuate the building on a hunch. You install sensors, strain gauges on the steel, crack monitors across the fracture, tilt meters on the columns, and then you leave, and you let the building tell you the truth over time, under its normal loads, while it thinks nobody is watching. The building always tells the truth. It simply will not tell you on demand. So in June of that year, I instrumented my life. I want to walk you through exactly how I did it, because I have learned that people imagine this kind of thing as something dramatic. It is not. It is boring. It is the most boring work in the world, and that is precisely why it succeeds. The first thing I did was drive 40 minutes to an office in Carmel, Indiana, and hire a woman named Elena Cruz. Elena Cruz spent 19 years as a forensic accountant for the Internal Revenue Service in the Criminal Investigation Division, and she now runs a 2-person practice doing what she describes on her website as financial reconstruction. I had worked opposite her once, in 2011, on a case involving a collapsed retail roof in Terre Haute. The building had failed because of snow load, but it had failed on a roof that had been certified as reinforced, and the reinforcement had been billed at $240,000, and the reinforcement did not exist. I proved the roof was never strengthened. Elena Cruz proved where the money went. She remembered me. She poured me a cup of terrible coffee, and she listened to me for 50 minutes, without interrupting once. When I finished, she said, "Mr. Marsh, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer." I said, "All right." She said, "Do you want me to find out that your son is stealing from you, or do you want me to find out whether he is?" I sat with that. It was, I thought, the single best question anyone had asked me in 19 months. I said, "I have spent my entire career being paid by people who wanted a specific answer, and giving them the real one instead. I would like the real one." She said, "Then we're going to do this properly, and it's going to be slow, and you're not going to like how slow it is." I said slow was fine. I said I had time. She said, "No, you don't. You have until he gets you to sign something." Her fee was $375 an hour. Over the following 14 months, I would pay Elena Cruz $61,400. It is the best money I have ever spent, including the down payment on the house where I raised my children. The second thing I did was much simpler, and it cost me $209. I put my house on the record. Now, I want to be careful here, because people get this wrong constantly. Indiana is a one-party consent state for the recording of oral communications, which means that a person who is a party to a conversation may record that conversation without informing the other party. I confirmed this in writing with Frank Delgado before I did anything, and I have his written opinion in a folder, and I have never once relied on my own understanding of a law when a professional's understanding was available to me for $400. This matters. Every man in my position who has ever ruined his own case did it by getting clever with something he did not understand. I do not get clever. I get correct. So in my study, in my kitchen, and in the front room where Helen died, I placed 3 small recording devices. They were not hidden in any elaborate way. One sat inside a hollowed-out copy of a 1968 structural steel design manual on my study shelf, which is a book that no living person other than me has ever opened. One sat in the base of a table lamp in the kitchen. The third sat inside the piano bench in the front room. The piano was gone. Helen's piano had been sold in March because I could not walk past it. But I had kept the bench, and I had kept it because I could not explain to myself why. And now I had a reason. Each device was voice-activated. Each held 250 hours. Every Sunday evening, after Claire's 4 o'clock call, I pulled the cards, copied the files to an external drive, made a second copy that went into a safe deposit box at a credit union 11 miles from my house, and logged the date, time, and duration of every file in a spiral notebook. 14 months, 58 Sundays. I did not miss one. I want to tell you what that was actually like, because I think the version of this story that people imagine is exciting. And the truth is that it was the loneliest year of my life. Every Sunday night, I sat at my desk with headphones on, and I listened to my own house. Most of it was nothing. Hours and hours of nothing. The refrigerator cycling, the mail dropping through the slot, my own footsteps, my own voice, once, talking to Helen out loud in the kitchen, the way I had started doing without ever quite deciding to, saying something completely ordinary about the weather, and then stopping, and then a very long silence, on the recording, where I stood in my kitchen and remembered. I listened to that. I logged it. File 0341. Duration 11 minutes. No relevant content. I sat there at 71 years old, transcribing the sound of myself being lonely, and marking it as irrelevant to the investigation. That was the price. I want people to understand that there is a price. There is no version of this where you set a trap for someone you love, and it does not cost you something. Marcus and Priscilla came to my house 49 times over the following 14 months. 49 visits, from a son who had come 9 times in the 3 years before his mother died. I have the numbers. I have always had the numbers. And on every single one of those visits, I performed. I want to describe the performance, because I have thought about it a great deal since, and I am not entirely sure it was a performance at all. Here is what I did. I let things be slightly wrong. I put the milk in the cabinet twice, on days I knew they were coming. Not the same day. Once in August, once in November. I left it where Priscilla would find it, and I let her find it, and I let her say, "Oh, Theo," in that soft voice, and I let myself look confused and a little ashamed. I misplaced my reading glasses while they were sitting on my head, which is a thing that every human being over 60 has done sincerely, at least once, and which is therefore the most credible failure available to you. I called Marcus by his uncle's name, once, in September. My brother Raymond has been dead since 2004. And when I said Raymond, and then corrected myself with a little laugh, I watched my son and my daughter-in-law exchange a look across my kitchen that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. I let a bill go unpaid. A real one. The water bill. $38, which I let go delinquent by 19 days, and then paid, on purpose, with a late fee of $6, and which I left sitting open on the counter, where it would be seen. That $6 late fee was the best $6 I have ever spent. Priscilla photographed it. I know she photographed it, because she leaned over my counter with her phone, and I was standing in the doorway behind her, and I watched her do it. And I said nothing. I want to be honest about something ugly. Somewhere around month 4, I began to enjoy it. Not the loneliness, not the recordings, but the performance. There is a strange and shameful pleasure in being underestimated on purpose. It is a kind of power that costs nothing, and that nobody can take away from you, because it lives entirely in the gap between what a person believes about you and what is actually true. My whole career, I had lived in that gap. I walked into rooms full of executives and attorneys who saw a quiet man in a cheap suit with a clipboard, and they talked freely in front of me, the way you talk in front of furniture. And then 11 months later, I would sit in a witness box and take their company apart, joint by joint, in a voice that never rose above conversational. They never saw it coming, not once, not in 142 cases. The thing about being underestimated is that it is only humiliating if you are trying to be seen. I was not trying to be seen, I was trying to be right. By September, the visits had developed a rhythm. They would arrive around 2 in the afternoon, which is a time chosen with some care, because 2 in the afternoon is when a 71-year-old man is at his lowest, blood sugar dropping. Post-lunch. It is the hour when confusion is most plausible. They would bring something. A casserole Priscilla had bought and transferred into her own dish. A bag of oranges. Once a pill organizer that I did not need and did not use. They would ask about my sleep. They would ask about my knee. They would ask, always, whether I had been getting out. And then, sometime around the 40-minute mark, one of them would mention the document. Never urgently, never twice in the same visit. A single gentle mention, dropped like a stone into a well, and then a change of subject. Frank's office called about that paperwork, Dad. No pressure at all, Theo, but the accountant did ask. Honestly, Dad, it's just to take things off your plate. 49 visits. I counted 29 separate mentions of the agreement. I logged every one, with date, time, phrasing, and which of them said it. 29 gentle stones, dropped one at a time into a well, for 14 months. That is not a request. That is a load test. You apply pressure repeatedly, at a low level, and you watch for deflection. And I deflected. Beautifully. Every single time. I would say, I'll look at it this week. I would say, my eyes have been bad lately. I would say, I think I misplaced my copy, which sent Priscilla to her car for a fresh printout, and which meant that over 14 months, I accumulated 6 separate physical copies of that document, each printed on a different date, and here is what nobody thinks about. They were not identical. The version they brought me in June had a signature line for one witness. The version they brought me in October had a signature line for a notary, and page 6 had grown by 2 paragraphs. And the version Priscilla printed for me in February, the one she brought in a manila folder still warm from her car, had a new clause, on page 5, that I read standing at my own kitchen counter while she was in the bathroom. It transferred the deed of the house on Delaware Street into a revocable trust, of which the sole trustee was Marcus Theodore Marsh, not on his death, not on my incapacity, on signature. I put the folder down. I walked to the sink. I ran the water, and I put both hands flat on the counter, and I looked out the window at the maple tree in the backyard that Helen and I planted in 1981, and I breathed until my hands stopped. Then I turned off the water. And when Priscilla came out of the bathroom, I was standing exactly where she left me, holding page 5 upside down, squinting at it. She took it out of my hands, gently, and she turned it the right way around, and she said, "There you go, Theo," and she patted my arm. I want to tell you what Elena Cruz was doing during all of this, because it is the actual spine of this story, and the recordings were only ever the skin. Elena worked backward. That is the entire method, and it is the same method I used for 38 years on failed buildings. You do not start from the crime. You start from the outcome, and you walk backward until you find the load path. She started with a question I would never have thought to ask. She did not ask what Marcus wanted from me. She asked what Marcus owed. In the first month, she pulled everything that is publicly filed, and that most people never bother to look at: County Recorder's Office, Secretary of State business filings, civil court dockets in 4 counties, Uniform Commercial Code liens. She found the following, and she found all of it in 11 days, for $4,000. Marcus had personally guaranteed a commercial loan in 2022 in the amount of $1.1 million, secured against a retail development in Anderson, Indiana. The anchor tenant had walked in 2023. The property was, at the time she looked at it, 68% vacant. He was in default. The lender had filed a notice of intent in the previous November, 3 weeks before he first came to my kitchen table with coffee and concern about my stairs. There was a second loan, private. A hard money lender in Chicago, $460,000, at 19%. There was a lien against his house. There was a judgment from a subcontractor for $81,000, unpaid for 19 months. Elena laid it all out on her conference table in a single column, in date order, and she put her pen down and she said, "Mr. Marsh, your son is not greedy. Your son is drowning." I said, "Is there a difference?" She said, "There's an enormous difference. And it's the difference between a man who will stop when he gets enough and a man who cannot stop, because there is no amount that is enough. The second kind is far more dangerous, and he is the second kind." I asked her what he needed. She did some arithmetic on a legal pad, and she turned it around so I could see it. 2.1 million, to make it all go away. The patent sale offer was 2.6. I looked at those two numbers, sitting one above the other, in Elena Cruz's handwriting, and I understood the entire structure of what was being built around me. Not a plot, not a scheme, exactly. An engineering solution. My son had a load he could not carry, and he had found a member in the structure that could carry it, and he was in the process of transferring the load onto me. That is all it was. To him, I do not think it was even cruelty. It was load transfer. I was simply the strongest thing in the vicinity. There is a fact about that year that I have never told anyone, and I am going to tell it now, and then I am going to move on. In November, I nearly signed. It was a Thursday. It was the 17th. It had rained all day, and the light in the kitchen was the color of dishwater. And Marcus came alone, without Priscilla, and he sat across from me, and he did not mention the document at all. He talked about his mother. He talked about a fishing trip we took in 1989, to a lake in Michigan, where he caught a bass that was almost certainly not as large as he has always claimed it was, and where Helen fell asleep in the boat with a paperback on her chest, and where I did not catch a single fish in 4 days, and did not care even slightly. He remembered the name of the lake. He remembered the name of the cabin. He cried, a little, and he was not performing. I have spent a year with my son on tape. I know what he sounds like when he is performing. He was not performing. And I sat there, across from my son, in my wife's kitchen, and I thought, I could stop. Right now, I could put all of this down. I could tear up Elena's file and pull the cards out of the recorders and sign whatever he wants and give him the money and the house and the patent and every dollar Helen and I ever saved, and he would hug me, and he would mean it, and I would have my son back. That is the offer. That is always the offer. People think the hard part is catching them. The hard part is that you love them, and there is a door, and the door is always open, and all you have to do to walk through it is agree to be a fool for the rest of your life. I got up and I made him a sandwich, ham and mustard, which is what he ate as a child. He left around 6, and I sat in that kitchen until the light went out of it entirely. And then I went into my study, and I opened the drawer, and I wrote the date on the legal pad, and underneath it, I wrote, "Emotional loading event. No structural change. Continue monitoring." And I want to be very clear that I cried while I wrote it. Being right and being unfeeling are not the same thing. I have never understood why people assume they are. Every man I ever put on a witness stand was somebody's son. That winter, Claire started to notice. My daughter is not a stupid woman, and she is a nurse, and nurses are professionally trained to detect exactly one thing above all others: the patient who is minimizing. She called on a Sunday in January, at 4 o'clock exactly, and after 11 minutes of ordinary conversation, she went quiet, and then she said, "Dad, what's going on?" Not a question. She did not put a question mark on it. I said nothing was going on. She said, "You've said the words 'I'm fine' 4 times in this call. You have never said 'I'm fine' to me in my entire life. You say 'I'm all right,' or you say 'not bad,' or you don't answer at all. So I'm going to ask you again." And this is where I made the second decision that mattered, and it was harder than the first. I did not tell her. I want to explain why, because it looks like distrust, and it was the opposite of distrust. Claire is an honest person, fundamentally, structurally honest, in a way that I find genuinely beautiful, and that made her, in that particular year, a catastrophic liability. If I told Claire what was happening, Claire would confront her brother within 72 hours. She would not be able to help it. She would look at him across a Thanksgiving table, and it would come out of her like water out of a cracked pipe, and Marcus would know, and the recorders would come out of the walls, and Elena's investigation would die, and I would have nothing. 14 months of evidence. Gone. Because I could not bear to let my daughter worry about me for a little while longer. So I lied to my daughter for 9 months. I said I was fine. I said the grief was hitting me harder in the winter. I said I was sleeping badly. That last one was true. She did not believe me. Not for 1 second. But she is a good daughter, and she let me have it. And she started calling twice a week instead of once. And she started driving down from Fort Wayne on Saturdays, without announcing it in advance. Which, as it happens, is how she came to be standing on my porch at 10:40 in the morning on the 8th of March, holding a bag of bagels, when Marcus's car was in my driveway. I heard her car. I was in the kitchen. Marcus and Priscilla were in the front room. And I made a decision in about a second and a half. I did not go to the door. I stood in my kitchen, next to the lamp with the recorder in its base, and I let my daughter walk into the front room. I want to tell you exactly what she heard, and I know exactly what she heard, because I have the file. File 0417. Duration, 19 minutes, 40 seconds. Priscilla said, "Claire, we didn't know you were coming." And Claire said, "It's my father's house." And Priscilla said, and her voice on that recording is perfectly pleasant, perfectly warm, the voice of a woman offering somebody a drink. "Of course, we've just been trying to get ahead of things." He's not been himself, Claire. Marcus and I have been carrying quite a lot. And my daughter said, "What things?" And my son said, "It's just paperwork, Claire." 19 minutes. I stood in my kitchen and listened through the doorway, and I did not move, and I let my daughter defend me in a room I was not standing in. She was magnificent. She asked 11 questions. She got 0 answers. And at the end of it, she came into the kitchen, and she looked at me, and I was standing there with a coffee cup in my hand, and my face arranged into mild, pleasant vagueness, and she looked at me for about 4 seconds, and her eyes changed. She did not say anything. She put the bagels on the counter. She kissed my cheek, and on her way out, at the door, with her back to the front room, she squeezed my hand once, very hard. She knew. She did not know what, but she knew that I knew. and she knew that she was supposed to say nothing. My daughter figured out in 4 seconds, from across a kitchen, what my son could not see in 14 months from 3 feet away. The difference is that Claire was looking at me. Marcus was only ever looking at what I had. I want to tell you about the Thanksgiving, because it is the single worst thing I did that year, and I have never told anyone the whole of it. They came to my house on the 27th of November. Marcus, Priscilla, and their daughter Paige, who is 19, and who is a sophomore at Purdue, and who has, as far as I have ever been able to determine, no idea who her mother is. Claire came too. She drove down from Fort Wayne, and she brought 2 pies, and she was that day, in the middle of the 9 months during which I was lying to her. So there were 5 of us at a table that was built for 8, and I did something at that table that I have not been able to put down. Priscilla brought up the document. Of course she did. Around the time the plates were being cleared, in that warm, loose hour when nobody is guarding anything, she said, "Theo, I hate to be the one, but the accountant has been after us about the paperwork." And Claire, who did not know anything, who was standing at my sink rinsing a dish, said, "What paperwork?" And Priscilla said, "Just estate housekeeping, sweetheart. Very boring." And my daughter turned around with a wet plate in her hand and said, "Dad, what paperwork?" And this is what I did. I looked at my daughter, and I made my face go slack and pleasant and empty, and I said, "I don't remember, honey." And I watched her believe me. I watched Claire's face do the thing that a nurse's face does when a patient tells her something that confirms the diagnosis she was hoping to be wrong about. It is a very small thing. It is a tightening around the eyes and a very slight lift in the shoulders as she braces. She put the plate down. She dried her hands, and she came over, and she put her hand on the back of my neck, the way you do with a child, and she said, "That's okay, Dad." Priscilla was watching this. Priscilla was watching my daughter accept the evidence, and Priscilla was pleased. I could see that she was pleased. I used my daughter as a witness against myself, at my own Thanksgiving table, in front of the woman who was building a case to have me locked up, because I needed Priscilla to believe I was falling apart. And there is no more convincing corroboration in the world than the honest concern of a person who loves you. Claire went outside about 20 minutes later and sat in her car for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched her from the window over the sink, and I stood at that window, drying a plate that was already dry, and I watched my daughter cry in a car in my driveway on Thanksgiving because she thought her father was going away. And I did not go out there. I have done a great many hard things in my life. I have identified the bodies of 2 men in a collapsed trench in 1992, and I have told their foreman that his shoring was inadequate and that it was his fault. I have sat with my wife for the last 19 days of her life. Not going out to that car is the worst thing I have ever done. I want that on the record, and I do not want anybody to tell me it was necessary, because I know it was necessary, and that is not the same thing as being all right. There is a cost. I keep saying it. Everyone hears the ending, and nobody hears the cost. The cost was 11 minutes in a driveway on a cold day, and I was not in that car, and I could have been. There is one more thing about that Thanksgiving. At the very end of the night, when they were getting their coats, my granddaughter Paige stopped in the front hall and looked at the wall. There is a photograph there. Helen and me, in 1979, standing in front of a house we did not own yet, holding a baby, and Paige said, "Grandpa, is that Dad?" And I said yes, and she said, "He looks like you." And Priscilla called from the door, "Paige, honey, we're going." And my granddaughter, 19 years old, in a coat that cost more than my first car, looked at that photograph for another second, and then she looked at me, and she said, very quietly, so that only I could hear her, "Grandpa, are you okay? Actually." And I looked at that girl, and I understood, in about half a second, that she was the one person in that entire house who had asked me an honest question in 14 months, and that if I answered her honestly, she would tell her mother within a week, because she is 19 and she has no armor at all. So I lied to her too. I said, "I'm fine, sweetheart." And she nodded, and she looked unconvinced, and she left. Paige testified for the prosecution in her mother's trial. She was not asked to. She called Delia Vargas herself, in the spring, from her dorm room at Purdue. She was on the stand for 19 minutes, and she was asked about a conversation she had overheard in her own kitchen in the previous January, and she answered every question, and she did not look at her mother once. She lives with Claire now. She spent last Christmas at the house on Delaware Street. She is the only good thing that came out of that marriage, and she got out, and I did not help her do it. She did that entirely alone at 19 years old. I would like everyone listening to hold that in their mind for a moment before we go on. That girl was the third one they underestimated, and she is the only one of the three of us who had no evidence, no lawyer, no forensic accountant, and nothing to gain. She just told the truth because it was the truth. In April, the pressure changed. For 14 months they had been patient with me, because patience was working. Patience always works right up until the moment it stops. And then people who have been patient for a long time become extremely dangerous, because they have already decided they are owed. What changed was that the lender in Anderson filed. Elena called me on a Tuesday morning and told me that the foreclosure complaint had been entered in Madison County the previous Friday, and that Marcus had 28 days to respond, and that there was no response available to him that did not involve $2 million. She said, "Mr. Marsh, your timeline just collapsed. Whatever you're planning, you have about 6 weeks." I said, "I'm not planning anything. I'm documenting." She said, "Then, you have about 6 weeks to stop documenting." And that same week, Priscilla called me and asked, in a voice absolutely swimming with warmth, whether I would let her plan a party. For my anniversary, my 50th. Helen had been dead for 19 months. There was no anniversary. There was a date on a calendar in June, where an anniversary used to be. But Priscilla explained it to me at length, on the phone, and she was very moving about it. She said that Helen would have wanted the family to mark it. She said 50 years is 50 years whether or not both people are still standing. She said, and I am quoting her exactly, because I wrote it down within 4 minutes of hanging up, "Theo, you deserve to be honored. You've given this family everything. Let us give you one night." And I said yes. I said yes immediately. I did not hesitate for a second, because in 38 years of failure analysis, you learn to pray for one thing, and one thing only. You pray for a load test. You can inspect a structure forever. You can photograph every crack and measure every deflection, and model every stress path in a computer, and you will still, at the end of it, be a man with an opinion, because a building at rest is a building that is hiding. What you want more than anything in the world, is for the building to be put under maximum load, in front of witnesses, while your instruments are running. They wanted 240 people in a room. They wanted my whole family, my whole church, Helen's colleagues, my former partners from the firm, my neighbors of 40 years. They wanted every single person whose opinion of me mattered, gathered in one place, on one night, with a microphone and a stage and a program. They wanted an audience. So did I. Priscilla planned that party for 11 weeks, and she planned it beautifully, and she sent me photographs of centerpiece options that I did not look at. And while she planned it, I did 3 things. The first was that I went to see Frank Delgado, and I sat in his office for 4 hours, and I did not leave until every document was signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed. I revoked every power of attorney that existed. I executed a new will. I moved the investment account into a trust with a corporate trustee, an institution in Chicago that does not care about anyone's feelings, and I named Claire as the sole successor beneficiary with a spendthrift provision that Frank described as aggressive. And I did not sell the patent. That surprised him. He asked me why. I said, because they think it's the prize. Let them keep thinking that. Frank Delgado, who has known me for 26 years, looked at me for a moment and then said, Theodore, I've watched you do this to insurance companies. I have never once enjoyed being on the other side of it, and I do not envy your son. The second thing I did was I called Elena Cruz, and I told her to stop being subtle. She had been working quietly, from public records and paper. I told her I wanted everything, and I wanted it in a form that a prosecutor could pick up and carry into a courtroom without any additional work. She said, that's a different kind of engagement. That's about $40,000. I said, do it. And she said, and this is the moment I realized that Elena Cruz had been holding something back. Mr. Marsh, before you spend that money, I need to show you something I found in March that I have not told you about, because I wanted to be certain, and as of Thursday, I am certain. I said, show me. She said, not on the phone. Come in tomorrow. And Mr. Marsh, and she paused, and she is not a woman who pauses. Bring somebody with you, not your son. The third thing I did was the smallest, and it is the one I have thought about most since. I went to the Fairmont, alone, on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks before the party. I told the events manager that I was the father of the host, and that I wanted to see the room. He walked me through the empty ballroom. I asked him about the sound system. I asked him whether the podium microphone was fed to the house speakers or just the podium monitors. I asked whether there was a projector and where the input was and whether it accepted a laptop with an HDMI cable. He answered all of it, cheerfully, because I was a pleasant old man asking about a party. And then I asked him one more question. I asked him whether the room had a service corridor and where it exited, and whether a person coming in that way would arrive at the front of the room or the back. He said the front. He said it comes out right beside the head table. I thanked him. I shook his hand. I drove home, and on my legal pad that night I wrote, Load path identified. Access at head table. Confirm HDMI Friday. Now I am going to tell you about the recording. There are, in the 14 months of files I collected, exactly 491 hours of audio. Most of it, as I have said, is nothing. But there is one file, File 0508, recorded on the 11th of May, at 9:14 in the evening. Duration, 41 minutes, 6 seconds. Location, the base of the lamp on my kitchen table. Here is the situation. Marcus and Priscilla had come for dinner. I had cooked, badly, on purpose. Around 8:30, I told them I was exhausted, and I was going up to bed. I went upstairs. I closed my bedroom door audibly. I ran the water in my bathroom for 2 minutes. I turned on my bedroom light, and then, after 90 seconds, I turned it off. And then, I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, fully dressed, at 71 years old, and I did not move for 4 hours, because a man who has gone to bed is furniture, and people talk in front of furniture. They talked for 41 minutes. I am not going to give you all of it. I am going to give you what matters, and I am going to give it to you the way I heard it 3 days later, with headphones on in my study at 2 in the morning, which is that it arrived slowly, and then all at once, and then I had to stop the tape and go stand outside in my own backyard for 20 minutes. At minute 6, Priscilla says, "He's not signing it, Marcus. He is never signing it. It's been a year." At minute 8, Marcus says, "He'll sign it. He's just slow." At minute 11, Priscilla says, "He's not slow. He's stubborn. And there's a difference. and you refuse to see it because he's your father. And then, 30 seconds later, in a completely different voice, flat, practical, the voice of somebody reading a grocery list, she says, "So we stop asking him to sign, and we get a court to sign for him." At minute 14, my son says, "Jesus, Priscilla." At minute 15, he says, "How?" That is the sentence, right there. That is the sentence that ends a 30-year relationship between a father and a son, and it is one word long. How? Not no, not that's my father, not absolutely not. How? What follows is 30 minutes of the two of them, at my kitchen table, on my chairs, with the plates from my dinner still on the table, planning a guardianship petition against me. Priscilla had done research, extensive research. She used the phrase, petition for appointment of guardian over an incapacitated person, with the fluency of somebody who had read the statute more than once. She had a physician, a man in Zionsville who, she explained, does these evaluations all the time, and who would need to see me twice, in the afternoon, and who would need a family history from the people who see him daily. That was her phrase. A family history from the people who see him daily. At minute 22, she began listing the evidence. She listed the milk in the cabinet. She listed the water bill with the late fee. And she said she had photographed it. And she gave the date. She listed the time I called Marcus by his dead brother's name. She listed the fall in November, which never happened. She listed the fact that I had been talking to Helen in the kitchen, which she had heard, once, in October, from the hallway, and which she described as, "And I want this to sit with you for a moment. The big one. That's the big one. He's talking to his dead wife. A judge hears that, and it's over in 4 minutes." I had to stop the tape there. That is where I stopped it. I went out into my backyard, at 2 in the morning, in my slippers, and I stood under the maple tree that Helen and I planted in 1981. And I put my hand flat against the trunk of it. They were going to use my grief to prove I was insane. The single truest, most human, most sane thing I did in that entire miserable year, standing in an empty kitchen talking out loud to the woman I was married to for 50 years, was the thing they had selected as the proof that I could no longer be trusted with my own name. I want to be careful with what I say next, because there are men who would tell you that this is the moment they stopped feeling anything. That is not what happened to me. What happened to me is that I started feeling everything, all at once, and I understood with total clarity that the feeling was not useful, and that I could either sit down under that tree and be a heartbroken old man for the rest of my life, or I could go back inside and finish the analysis. I stood there for 20 minutes, and then I went back inside, and I put the headphones on, and I pressed play, and I listened to the last 18 minutes, because that is the job. You go back inside. The building does not care how you feel about it. The building only cares whether you finish the report. In the last 18 minutes, they discussed the timeline. Priscilla said the petition should be filed after the anniversary party, not before. Marcus asked why, and Priscilla said, "Because 200 people are going to watch him at that party, and I want every single one of them to have a story." She said the party was the evaluation. She said, "And I have played this back so many times that I can recite it with the pauses. We're not throwing him a party, Marcus. We're building a record. We put him somewhere quiet. We keep him away from the microphone. We let people watch him sit there confused all night. And then when the petition gets filed, half the county has already seen it with their own eyes. We put him somewhere quiet." That is the sentence that put me at table 9. It was not an insult. It was not thoughtlessness. It was not, "we ran out of room." It was a deliberate act of clinical staging, designed and executed by my daughter-in-law, to place a 71-year-old man in the most humiliating and isolated position in a room of 240 witnesses. so that when a judge later asked those witnesses how the old man had seemed at his own anniversary party, they would all say the same thing. He seemed lost. He was sitting alone. He was in the back, with the children. They were not seating me at the children's table. They were building an exhibit. And at minute 39 of that recording, my son, who caught a base in Michigan in 1989 and who cried in my kitchen about his mother, my son said, "And after the guardianship, what happens to him, actually?" And Priscilla said, "Sunridge takes memory care residence on a guardian's signature. It's $4,100 a month, and the trust pays for it. And Theo, honestly, will probably be happier there." And Marcus said nothing for 11 seconds. I have timed it. 11 seconds. And then he said, "Okay." That was the last word on the recording that mattered. Okay. 50 years of marriage. 2 children. 4,000 piano students. A house on Delaware Street with a maple tree in the yard. Okay. Now Elena Cruz. I drove to Carmel on a Thursday morning in the middle of May. And I brought Frank Delgado with me, because she had told me to bring somebody. And Frank was the only person alive who I could bring. Elena had a conference room with a long table, and on that table she had laid out 11 manila folders in a row, and she did not say hello. She said, "Sit down, Mr. Marsh. I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." I sat down. She said, "Your son is stealing from you. You know that. That is not why I asked you to come in." She opened the first folder. She said, "Your son has been stealing from you for 4 years, and your wife knew." I want to describe what happened in my chest at that moment, and I cannot. There is no engineering term for it. There is no crack-width comparator for that. I said, "That is not possible." Elena Cruz, who spent 19 years in the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, and who does not soften things, said, "It is not only possible, it is documented, and I believe she was trying to tell you." The patent royalties. For 29 years, the licensing company in Cleveland had sent the royalty payments to an account, a joint account held by Helen and me at a regional bank, and the statements came by mail, and Helen handled them, because Helen handled all of the household finance for our entire marriage. And I want you to understand that this was not a division born of laziness on my part. She was better at it. She had a bookkeeper's mind and an absolutely ferocious memory for a number. In 2021, Marcus offered to digitize our records. He came over with a laptop, and he spent 2 weekends in our study, and he was very helpful. And at the end of it, he had set up online banking for both of us, and consolidated the paper statements, and enrolled us in paperless billing. Helen and I were, respectively, 68 and 67 years old. We thought it was a nice thing for a son to do. What Marcus did, in those 2 weekends, was change the mailing address of record on the royalty account to a post office box in Fishers, Indiana. He added himself as an authorized signer on the account, using a signature card that Helen signed, because he handed it to her in a stack of 11 documents and told her it was for the paperless enrollment. And then, for 4 years, he moved money. Not all of it. That is the thing. That is the thing that made it work for 4 years. He took, on average, between 9 and 14%. He took it in irregular amounts. He took it as transfers to an LLC he controlled, called Marsh Legacy Holdings, which he had registered in 2021, and which he had. And Elena laid this document flat on the table in front of me and put one finger on it, described on the registration filing as Family Estate Management. Over 4 years, Marcus took $187,400. I looked at that number for a long time, and then I said, "Elena, how did Helen know?" And Elena Cruz opened the 9th folder. Inside it were 17 pages of photocopied handwriting, my wife's handwriting. The same hand that wrote the shopping list on my refrigerator, which is still there, which I have not taken down, and which I am not going to take down. She said, "These came from the safe deposit box you gave me access to in February. They were in an envelope, in the back, behind the deed. Nobody had opened them. They are dated." Helen had been keeping a ledger. Starting in March of 2023, 2 years before her diagnosis, my wife had begun hand-copying the royalty statements before Marcus's transfers cleared, and comparing them against the balances. And she had been doing it, in pencil, on graph paper, every single month, for 26 months. She had found the discrepancy in her 4th month. She had documented every transfer. She had written the amounts. She had written the dates. And in the margins, in that beautiful looping hand, she had written notes to herself. On one page, "Ask him. Give him the chance to say it first." On the next page, 3 months later, "Asked. He said it was a fee. There is no fee. Teddy will not survive this." And on the last page, which is dated the 11th of October, 7 weeks before she died, in handwriting that had gotten very bad by then, very shaky, she had written, "Cannot do this to him now. He will find it. He finds everything. Tell him when I am gone. Tell him gently." She never told me. She was dying, and she was holding a ledger that proved her son was a thief, and she made a decision. She made a decision, in a hospice bed, in the front room where the piano used to be, that she would carry it out of the world with her, rather than hand it to me while she was still in the house, because she thought I could not survive it while I still had to watch her die. She was protecting me. She was 70 years old, and she was in the last months of her life, and her son was robbing her, and the thing she was worried about was me. I sat in Elena Cruz's conference room, with Frank Delgado's hand on my shoulder, and I cried for the first time since the funeral. Not quietly, not with any dignity whatsoever. I want to tell you what broke me, and it was not the theft. It was the phrase, "Tell him gently." She knew exactly what I would do. She was married to me for 50 years. She knew that I would find every document and build every file, and take our son apart with the same patience I had used on 142 collapsed buildings, and that I would be right, and that being right would not save me. Tell him gently. She was not trying to protect Marcus. She was trying to protect me from what I was going to become. And here is the thing I have not been able to put down since. I am not sure she succeeded. I am not sure she was wrong to worry. And there are nights, still, when I lie in that house and I wonder whether the man who walked into the Fairmont Grand Ballroom that June was the man Helen was married to, or something colder that grew in the space she left. I did not tell her ledger to Frank Delgado for 3 days. When I finally did, he said one sentence. He said, "Theodore, your wife just handed you a witness who cannot be cross-examined." There were 19 days between that conference room and the anniversary party. I have never worked harder in my life. And I include in that comparison the 11 weeks I spent in a hangar in Sacramento in 1998, reassembling 400 tons of collapsed parking structure on a concrete floor with chalk outlines. Here is what we did. Elena took Helen's ledger and did what she called a reconciliation, which meant that every single one of my wife's pencil entries on graph paper was matched against a bank record, a wire confirmation, or an LLC filing. 26 months, 291 individual entries. She got 291 matches. My wife, a retired music teacher, with no accounting training whatsoever, working alone, in pencil, while dying, had produced a set of books that a federal forensic accountant could not find a single error in. Elena said, and I am going to remember this until I die, "Mr. Marsh, I have testified against people who paid $100,000 for worse work than this." But the ledger was not the whole case. The ledger was the past. The guardianship was the future, and the guardianship was the thing that frightened me. And I want to explain why, because I think people underestimate it enormously. If you steal money from a man, he can sue you. If you take away his legal capacity, he cannot do anything at all. He cannot hire a lawyer, because he cannot enter into a contract. He cannot sell his house, because he does not control his house. He cannot move his money, or change his will, or sign a check, or refuse a medication, or decide where he sleeps at night. A guardianship does not take your property, it takes your standing. It takes the part of you that is allowed to object. And it is granted, in most counties in this country, in a hearing that lasts less than 20 minutes, on the strength of a physician's report and the testimony of concerned family members. I have seen a 40,000 square foot roof come down in 9 seconds. I have never in my life encountered a structure that could be demolished faster than an old man's legal existence. So we went at it from the other direction. Frank Delgado said, "We don't defend the guardianship. We destroy the petitioner." The physician in Zionsville was named Dr. Wesley Pruitt. Elena found him in 4 days. Dr. Wesley Pruitt had performed 161 capacity evaluations in the previous 3 years. He had found incapacity in 154 of them, 95.6%. He billed $2,200 per evaluation, and he was paid, in every case, by the party petitioning for the guardianship. Elena pulled his filings across 6 counties, and she built a spreadsheet, and on that spreadsheet, she cross-referenced the petitioners. Priscilla Marsh's name appeared twice. Once in this case, which had not yet been filed, and once, in 2022, in Hamilton County, in a guardianship petition filed regarding a woman named Dorothy Vance. Dorothy Vance was Priscilla's aunt. Dorothy Vance had been 81 years old, and she had owned a house in Noblesville, free and clear, and she had been placed under guardianship on the 22nd of September, on the strength of an evaluation by Dr. Wesley Pruitt, and her guardian had been her niece. The house was sold 4 months later for $395,000. Dorothy Vance died in a facility in Kokomo 14 months after that. The guardianship accounting filed with the court showed that of the $395,000, $118,000 had been paid out in what were described as guardian's fees and administrative expenses. Elena put that file on the table in front of me, and she said, very quietly, "Mr. Marsh, you are not the first one. You are the second one, and the only reason we know about the first one is that she is dead and the file is public." I sat with that for a long time, and then I asked the question that I had been trying not to ask for 14 months. And I asked it out loud, in that conference room, to a forensic accountant and a lawyer. I said, "Did my son know about the aunt?" And Elena said, "I can't prove what he knew." And Frank Delgado said, "Theodore, don't." And I said, "Elena, can you prove what he did?" And she opened a folder, and she slid one page across the table, and it was a signature page from the Dorothy Vance guardianship petition. There were 2 signatures on it, Priscilla Marsh and Marcus T. Marsh. Witness. He had signed it. 4 years ago, he had sat in a room and watched his wife do this to her own aunt, and he had put his name on the paper as a witness. And then he had come to Christmas dinner at my house that December and eaten my wife's ham and told me about a property he was buying in Anderson. I did not say anything for about a minute, and then I said, "All right." And Frank said, "Theodore." And I said, "Frank, that's the wrong grade of rebar." He said, "What?" I said, "This is what I do. This is exactly what I do. You never find one failure. If there's one, there's a system. And the system produced it. And the system will produce it again. And the only reason anyone ever thinks a collapse is an isolated event is that they didn't bother to check the other buildings the same contractor built. I stood up. I said, Elena, how many other buildings did Dr. Wesley Pruitt sign off on? And Elena Cruz, for the first time in 14 months, smiled at me. She said, 161, Mr. Marsh. She said, how many do you want? Here is the part that people do not expect, and it is the part I am proudest of. And it has nothing to do with my family. We took it to the county prosecutor, not to a civil attorney, not to a probate judge. Frank Delgado picked up a telephone and called a woman he had known for 19 years in the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, in the unit that handles crimes against at-risk adults, and he said, I need 40 minutes, and I need you to bring somebody who understands financial exploitation. We got the 40 minutes on the 2nd of June. We took 90. I sat at the end of a table in a government conference room, with fluorescent lights and a water stain on the ceiling. And I watched a prosecutor named Delia Vargas turn pages for an hour and a half without speaking. At the end of it, she took her glasses off, and she rubbed her eyes, and she said, Mr. Marsh, I want to be clear about something. If this were only about your money, this would be a civil case, and I would wish you luck. She put her hand flat on the Dorothy Vance file. She said, this is not about your money. This is a pattern. This is a doctor. And there are 161 other names on that list, and some of those people are still alive. She looked at me. She said, how long can you keep pretending? And I said, ma'am, I have been pretending for 14 months. I can pretend for 2 more weeks. She said, the party. I said, the party. And she said, tell me about the room. I told her about the room. I told her about the 240 guests, and the head table, and the projector with the HDMI input, and the podium microphone that fed the house speakers, and the service corridor that came out at the front, right beside the head table, and where it exited. I drew it for her, on a legal pad, to scale, because that is the other thing about 38 years of failure analysis. I can draw you any room I have ever stood in. Delia Vargas looked at that drawing for a while, and then she said, Mr. Marsh, I need you to understand that I cannot stage an arrest at a private party for dramatic effect. That's not how this works. I said, I'm not asking you to. I said, I'm telling you that on the 14th of June, at approximately 8 in the evening, in a room with 240 witnesses, my daughter-in-law is going to stand at a microphone and describe my mental decline to my entire community on a schedule she wrote herself, and she is going to do it in a room where I control the projector. I said, you don't have to do anything at all. You just have to be in the building. Delia Vargas sat back in her chair. She looked at Frank. Frank looked at the ceiling, and she said, I'll be in the building. There was one more thing Elena found, and she found it 8 days before the party, and it is the reason the case against Priscilla went to a jury instead of a plea. She called me at 6 in the morning. Elena Cruz does not call at 6 in the morning. She said, Mr. Marsh, Sunridge. I said, the facility. She said, it's not a facility, it's a business. And I pulled the corporate registration, and I want you to sit down. Sunridge Memory Care of Fishers, Indiana, is owned by a holding company registered in Delaware. That holding company has 3 members. One of them is an entity called Vance Family Holdings, LLC. Dorothy Vance, Priscilla's aunt, the 81-year-old woman whose house sold for $395,000, and out of which $118,000 evaporated into guardian's fees and administrative expenses. Elena had traced the money. $94,000 of Dorothy Vance's house, of an old woman's house in Noblesville, that she paid off over 31 years, had been used, in 2023, as a capital contribution to buy an ownership stake in the memory care facility where Priscilla intended to put me. I want you to understand the shape of that. It is not theft. Theft is simple. Theft is a man taking money out of an account. This is architecture. She took an old woman's house. She used it to buy a piece of the building. And then she was going to put me in the building. And my trust would pay $4,100 a month to the building. And a percentage of that would come back to her. Every month, for as long as I lived. She was not going to steal from me once. She was going to build a structure that would collect from me continuously, forever. And she had already used one relative to pour the foundation. I sat in my kitchen at 6 in the morning, with the phone in my hand, and Elena said, "Mr. Marsh, are you there?" And I said, "Elena, I have analyzed collapses that killed people. I have never in my life seen anything designed this well." And she said, "Neither have I." And I said, "How much of Sunridge does she own?" And Elena said, 11%. And she is listed as a manager. Which means, Mr. Marsh, that she would have been legally required to disclose her financial interest in the placement facility when she petitioned to become your guardian. I said, "And she wouldn't have." And Elena Cruz said, "She didn't. Not for Dorothy Vance. It's not on the Hamilton County filing. I have the filing. It's a sworn document. And the disclosure section is blank. That is the perjury count. That is the whole perjury count. And it came out of a blank line on a form that nobody in Hamilton County had looked at in 4 years. The building was already failing. It had been failing since 2022. Nobody checked. They never check. That has been the entire thesis of my professional life, and I have never once been wrong about it, and I take absolutely no pleasure in that. I flew Elena's report to Delia Vargas's office by courier that afternoon. And Delia called me at 9 that night, and she said one sentence. She said, "Mr. Marsh, your daughter-in-law didn't want your money. She wanted a tenant. The last thing I did before the party, I did alone. On the 12th of June, 2 days before, I drove to Fort Wayne. I did not call ahead. Claire opened her door at 7 in the evening in scrubs, having come off a 12-hour shift, and she looked at me standing on her porch, and her face did something complicated. She said, "Dad," I said, "I need 3 hours, and I need you to not say anything until I'm finished, and then I need you to decide something." She let me in. I sat at my daughter's kitchen table, and I put a folder on it, and I told her everything. All of it. 14 months. The recordings. Elena. The document with the trust clause on page 5. The guardianship. Dr. Wesley Pruitt. Dorothy Vance. And her mother's ledger. I had photocopied the 17 pages. I slid them across the table last, and I watched my daughter read her dead mother's handwriting, and I watched her get to the last page, and I watched her read, "Tell him gently," and I watched her put her hand over her mouth. She did not say anything for 4 minutes. I timed it, because I time everything, because I do not know how to stop. And then Claire said, "You lied to me for 9 months. I said, "Yes." She said, "You let me think you were losing it." I called Aunt Ruth. I asked her about early-stage indicators. I cried in my car in the hospital parking lot in February, because I thought my father was disappearing, and I couldn't get him to admit it. And I said, "Yes, I know. I'm sorry. I did not offer an excuse. I had one. It was a good one. I have laid it out for you already, and I believe it was correct, and I would make the same decision again." But she did not need my reasons. She needed my apology. And those are not the same thing, and it took me 71 years to learn the difference. She cried for a while, and then she wiped her face with the heel of her hand, the way she has done since she was 6 years old, and she looked at the folder on her table, and she said, "What do you need me to do?" And I said, "You're going to be seated at the head table on Saturday, table 1. Priscilla put you there because you're a nurse, and it looks good." I said, "I need you to sit there all night and be pleasant to your brother." And my daughter, my honest, structurally honest daughter, who cannot lie to a patient about a needle, looked me dead in the eye and said, "I've watched people die, Dad. I can get through a salad course." And then, at the door, when I was leaving, she asked me the only question that had ever actually mattered. She said, "Dad, when it's done, what happens to Marcus?" And I stood on my daughter's porch, at 71 years old, and I told her the truth. I said, "I don't know." I said, "I've spent 14 months finding out exactly what he did. I never once spent a minute deciding what to do about it, because I couldn't. Every time I got close, I stopped." I said, "So on Saturday, I'm going to walk into that room, and I'm going to put the truth on a wall in front of 240 people, and then I'm going to find out what kind of man I am, at the same time everybody else does." Claire looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "Mom knew what kind of man you are." And she closed the door. The 14th of June, 50 years to the day since a Methodist church in Fort Wayne, with 41 people in it, and a reception in the basement, that cost my father $180. I got to the Fairmont at 6:40 in the evening. I want to tell you what I was wearing, because it matters, and because it was the last piece of the analysis. I wore a gray suit, not the navy one, not the good one, a gray suit that I have owned since 2014, that fits me badly now, because I have lost 11 pounds since Helen died, and that I chose deliberately because it makes me look smaller than I am. I did not wear a tie. I combed my hair badly. I did it in my car, in the parking garage, in the rearview mirror, on purpose, and it took me a surprisingly long time to get it wrong in the right way. I carried a cheap black nylon laptop bag over my shoulder, the kind you get free at a conference. It is exactly the sort of thing a slightly confused older man carries around for no reason, because he has always carried a bag, and nobody thinks about it, and nobody looks inside it. Inside it was a laptop, an HDMI cable, and a thumb drive. On the thumb drive were 9 files. I walked into the lobby of the Fairmont Grand Hotel at 6:40 in the evening, and I stood for a moment, and I looked at myself in the mirrored column by the elevators, and I saw exactly what they were going to see. A thin, old man in a bad suit, with his hair uncombed, holding a bag he does not need, blinking in the lights. I have been in a lot of rooms in my life. I have testified in federal courthouses in 11 states. I have stood in a Sacramento parking garage with 400 tons of concrete over my head, knowing that the column beside me had already failed, and that the entire structure was being held up by nothing but the accumulated friction of its own rubble. I have never in my life been more calm than I was at 6:40 in the evening in that lobby. And I want to tell you why, and this is the last honest thing I am going to say before I take you into that room. It was not because I was confident. It was not because I was righteous. It was not because I had a thumb drive. It was because for 14 months I had been carrying something alone, and in about 90 minutes, I was going to put it down. That is all. That is the whole feeling. There is a peace that comes at the end of a very long analysis, and it does not have anything to do with what the report says. It is just that the work is finished. I took the escalator up to the mezzanine. I could hear the string quartet. I stopped at the table by the ballroom doors, where the place cards were laid out in rows, and I found mine. Theodore Marsh, in my daughter-in-law's neat, looping hand. Table 9. Marcus found me in the doorway. He put his hand on my shoulder, and he looked out at the room, and he said the sentence I have already told you about. He said, "It's not a big deal, Dad. We ran out of room, and I want you to understand something about that sentence." He had rehearsed it. I know he had rehearsed it, because I know exactly how many chairs were at the head table, and I know that 8 of them were empty, and I know that my son is not stupid. He knew I would count them. He had 30 seconds of cover story ready, and he deployed it before I had finished reading the card. That is not a man who ran out of room. That is a man who knew the room was wrong. So I looked up at my son, and I let my eyes go a little unfocused, and I said, "That's all right, Marcus. I'll sit anywhere." And he squeezed my shoulder, and he was relieved, and he steered me toward the back of the room, past table 8, past the service doors, to a round table with a paper tablecloth and 7 children on it. There was a booster seat at my place. It had been moved to the chair beside mine, but it had been at my place, and it was still touching my chair, and I have thought a great deal about whether that was cruelty or an accident, and I have concluded that it does not matter, even slightly. I sat down, and a 9-year-old boy named Owen, who is the son of my neighbor Ruth, from 4 houses down on Delaware Street, looked at me and said, "Are you in trouble?" And I said, "No, son." "Why?" And he said, "Because this is where they put you when you're in trouble." Out of the mouths of children. I sat at table 9 for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I want to walk you through those 2 hours and 40 minutes, because they were, without any question, the worst hours of my life, and I include in that the ones in the hospice room, because at least in that room, I was allowed to hold her hand. There was a receiving line. I was not in it. There was a photographer. He took a photograph of Marcus and Priscilla, standing under the banner, with my name and Helen's name on it, in gold. He took a photograph of Marcus and Priscilla with the mayor's chief of staff, who had come because Priscilla had invited him. He took 41 photographs before anybody thought to take one of me, and when they did, they came to table 9, and they photographed me sitting between 2 children. Priscilla directed that photograph. I watched her do it. She pointed at the table, and she said something to the photographer, and he came over, and he crouched down to get an angle that included the paper cups. She was building the record. She had told her husband she was going to build a record, on tape, in my kitchen, and I had heard her say it, and now I was sitting inside it. Helen's friends came to see me. That was the part that nearly ended me. That is the part I did not plan for, and I am a man who plans for everything. 9 women from the school district, retired music and art teachers, women who had known my wife for 30 years, came one at a time back to table 9, and they crouched down beside my chair, and they took my hand, and they said kind things, and they looked at me with pity. I watched in real time, over 2 hours, as my community revised their understanding of me. I could see it happening. It happened in the eyes. A woman named Dorothy Kemp, who taught with Helen for 26 years, held my hand and said, "Oh, Theo," and there was a wobble in her voice, and she was not being cruel, she was being kind, and it was so much worse. I let it happen. I sat there in my bad gray suit, with my hair combed wrong, and I let 240 people decide that the old man had gone soft. And I want to tell you the truth, because I have promised you the truth throughout. For about 40 minutes, in the middle of that dinner, I could not remember why I was doing it. I genuinely could not remember. The whole architecture of it, the recordings, Elena, the prosecutor, the thumb drive in the bag under my chair, went completely flat and meaningless, and all that was left was a 71-year-old man sitting at a children's table under a banner with his dead wife's name on it, eating cold chicken off a paper plate. That is what it costs. I keep saying it because nobody believes it. The pity nearly broke me, and the humiliation did not, and I have never been able to fully explain why. At 8:05, the string quartet stopped. The lights over the head table came up, and my daughter-in-law walked to the podium in a champagne-colored dress and tapped the microphone twice with one fingernail. The room went quiet, and she began to speak. She spoke for 11 minutes. She was magnificent. I want to be completely fair to her. Priscilla Marsh is the single most capable public speaker I have ever watched, who was not being paid to be one. She started with Helen. She talked about Helen's music. She got the room to laugh. twice, and she got them to go quiet, once, in a way that was genuinely moving, and I saw Dorothy Kemp wipe her eyes at table 2. And then, at about minute 6, she turned toward the back of the room, toward table 9, toward me, and her voice changed. It got softer, and warmer, and slower, and every single person in that ballroom leaned forward. She said, "And of course, tonight is really about Theo." 240 heads turned around. And she said, "Theo has had the hardest year of his life, and I don't think he'd mind me saying that this year has taken something out of him. Some of you have noticed." She let that sit. "Marcus and I have been out at the house on Delaware Street almost every week, and it's been a lot. It's a big house, and there are days that are better than others." She looked directly at me. Everyone in that room was looking directly at me, and she said, "So tonight isn't about asking Theo to do anything. Tonight, we just want him to sit and rest and let his family carry it for once." And 240 people applauded. They applauded warmly, sincerely. They looked back at the frail old man at the children's table, and they clapped for him. And several of them had tears in their eyes, and Priscilla stood at that microphone with her hand over her heart and accepted the applause on my behalf. And then she said, "Before we bring out the cake, Marcus has put together a little slideshow," and she gestured to the screen behind the head table. And she said, "Marcus, honey, is it plugged in?" And my son, standing at the head table, patted his pockets and looked at the laptop cart at the front of the room, beside the service corridor door. And he said, "The cable's not here. Hang on." Now I have spent 38 years being paid to understand exactly one thing, which is the moment at which a structure transitions from stable to unstable. It is never the loudest moment. It is almost always completely silent. In every high-speed camera recording of every collapse I have ever analyzed, there is a frame, 1/24th of a second, where nothing has visibly happened, and everything has already happened. The load has already found its new path. The building simply has not caught up yet. That frame, in the Fairmont Grand Ballroom, on the 14th of June, was the moment my son said, "The cable's not here," because I had the cable. It was in the cheap black nylon bag under my chair at table 9, where it had been for 2 hours and 40 minutes, because on the Friday before the party, I had come to that ballroom at 10 in the morning, and I had told the events manager that I was the father of the host, and I had asked him if I could check the projector input, and he had let me. Because I am a pleasant old man, and I had unplugged the house HDMI cable from the podium cart, and I had put it in my pocket, and I had walked out of the Fairmont Grand Hotel with it, and I had driven home. That is it. That is the whole plan. That is 14 months of work and $61,000. And 491 hours of audio. And it came down to a $7 cable that I stole on a Friday morning. I stood up. I want to describe what standing up felt like, and I do not think I am going to manage it. 2 hours and 40 minutes at that table. 14 months of pretending. 19 months of grief. 50 years of marriage. My knee locked. That is the truth, and I am not going to prettify it. My knee locked, exactly the way it had in that kitchen in November, and I put my hand on the paper tablecloth, and I stood up slowly, like an old man, because I am an old man, and 240 people watched me do it, and I picked up my bag, and I walked, past table 8, past table 7, past table 6, where my neighbor Ruth was sitting, and she reached out to take my arm, to help me, and I said, "Thank you, Ruth. I'm all right." The room had gone completely silent, not the silence of an audience, the silence of 240 people who are watching something go wrong and do not know what it is yet. Priscilla was still at the microphone. She said, "Theo, sweetheart, do you need, Marcus, help your father?" And Marcus started toward me, and I said, without raising my voice at all, and without stopping, "Sit down, Marcus." He stopped. I want to be honest about that. I have thought about why he stopped, and I do not think it was the words. I think it was that he had not heard that voice in about 20 years, and some part of him, that was still 9 years old in a boat in Michigan, recognized it before the rest of him could think. He sat down. I walked to the front of the room. I walked past the head table with the 8 empty chairs. I walked to the laptop cart beside the service corridor door, and I set my bag on the cart, and I unzipped it, and I took out my own laptop, and I took out my own HDMI cable, and I plugged it in, and the projector woke up. Priscilla said, "Theo, what are you doing?" And I looked up at her, at the podium, with the microphone in front of her, and I said, "You said the family should carry it for once." I said, "Let me help." And I walked up to the podium, and I stood beside her, and I said, very quietly, off microphone, so that only she could hear me, "Priscilla, step away from the microphone, or I will read page 5 out loud." She did not move for about 2 seconds, and then she stepped away from the microphone. I want to tell you what my daughter-in-law's face looked like in that moment, because I had waited 14 months to see it, and I have never gotten it out of my head. She did not look afraid. She looked annoyed. She looked at me the way a contractor looks at a load-bearing wall he did not expect to find in the middle of a renovation. Not fear, not shame, recalculation. She was already solving for it. Standing 3 feet from a microphone in a room of 240 people, with her entire scheme 2 seconds from the wall behind her, my daughter-in-law's first instinct was not panic. It was arithmetic. And that is the moment I stopped feeling anything at all about her. I stepped up to the microphone, and I adjusted it. It was set for a woman 5'6" in heels. I am 6'1". I raised it, slowly, and the little metal collar squeaked, and that squeak was the only sound in the room. Then I looked out at them, 240 faces, my church, my neighbors, Helen's colleagues, the men I worked with for 38 years, my daughter, at table 1, sitting perfectly still, with her hands folded in her lap, and I combed my hair back with my hand. That was all. That is the only theatrical thing I did that night. And I did not plan it. I just could not stand having it wrong anymore. And I said, "Good evening. My name is Theodore Marsh. I am 71 years old, and I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight to celebrate a marriage that lasted 50 years. I paused. My wife should be standing here. She isn't. So I'm going to do something she would have hated, and I'm going to ask you to forgive me for it. And I'm going to do it anyway, because she also would have understood exactly why. I looked down at the laptop, and I said, "For the last 14 months, my son and my daughter-in-law have been preparing to have me declared legally incompetent." Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. 240 people, and not one chair creaked. I said, "I know that, because I recorded them. In my own home, legally, in a one-party consent state, on the written advice of my attorney, who is sitting at table 4, and who will be happy to confirm that for anyone who asks him tonight." Frank Delgado raised his hand at table 4. He did not stand up. He just raised his hand, calmly, the way you do at an auction, and I pressed the space bar. The first slide came up on the 14-foot screen behind the head table, underneath the banner, with my name and Helen's name in gold. It was page 5 of the Family Care and Estate Simplification Agreement, and I had highlighted, in yellow, the clause that transferred the deed of the house on Delaware Street into a trust with my son as sole trustee, on signature. I said, "This is the document I was asked to sign 29 times. I counted. I clicked. The next slide was a spreadsheet. Elena Cruz's reconciliation, 291 rows. I said, between 2021 and 2025, my son Marcus removed $187,400 from a patent royalty account belonging to me and to my late wife, by adding himself as a signer on a card she signed, believing it was a paperless billing form. Somebody at table 6 said, out loud, "Oh my God." I clicked, and the next slide was not a document. It was a photograph, blown up to 14 feet, of a single sheet of graph paper, covered in pencil handwriting. I said, "That is my wife's handwriting." My voice did something on that sentence. I am not going to pretend it didn't. I said, "Helen found it in 2023. She kept a ledger, by hand, in pencil, for 26 months, including the last 11 weeks of her life. She never told me, because she was afraid of what it would do to me while she was dying." And I read the last line out loud. To 240 people, in a ballroom, on the 50th anniversary of the day I married her, I said, "Cannot do this to him now. He will find it. He finds everything. Tell him when I am gone. Tell him gently." And then I looked up, and I looked directly at my son, and I said, "I am afraid I am not able to be gentle, Marcus. I have tried for 14 months. It is the one thing your mother ever asked me for that I could not do." Marcus was crying, openly, sitting at the head table under his own mother's name in gold letters. And I felt nothing. That is not a boast. It is the opposite of a boast. It is the single greatest loss I sustained that year, and I want it on the record. I stood in front of my son while he wept, and there was nothing in me. She was right to be worried. I clicked, and I said, "Now I'm going to play you something. It's 41 seconds long." And I pressed play, and my daughter-in-law's voice came out of the house speakers of the Fairmont Grand Ballroom, at conversational volume, perfectly clear, saying, "We're not throwing him a party, Marcus. We're building a record. We put him somewhere quiet. We keep him away from the microphone. We let people watch him sit there confused all night. And then when the petition gets filed, half the county has already seen it with their own eyes." 240 people turned, in unison, and looked at table 9, at the paper tablecloth, at the paper cups, at the booster seat, still touching the chair I had been sitting in for 2 hours and 40 minutes. And then they turned back and looked at Priscilla, and Priscilla Marsh, who had recalculated in 2 seconds when I stepped up to the podium, made the only genuine mistake I ever saw her make. She said, into the room, in the ringing silence, in a voice that had lost all of its warmth, "That's illegal. He recorded me illegally. That is not admissible." And I let that hang for a moment. And then I leaned into the microphone, and I said, "That's a very specific objection." I said, "It's also wrong. Indiana Code 35-45-2-3. One-party consent. I am the party." I said, "But I notice you didn't say it wasn't true." Nobody said anything. And into that silence, from table 12, at the back of the room, a woman stood up. She was in her 40s. She was wearing a plain dark suit. She had been at that party for 2 hours and 40 minutes, eating chicken and making small talk. And not one person in that room had asked who invited her. She said, "Mr. Marsh, may I?" And I said, "Please." And Delia Vargas, Deputy Prosecuting Attorney for Marion County, walked to the front of the Fairmont Grand Ballroom, and she took out her credentials, and she held them up, and she said, "Marcus Marsh, Priscilla Marsh, I'd like you both to come with me, please." Nobody was arrested in that ballroom. I want to be honest about that, because I know what the movie version of this looks like, and the movie version is a lie. Delia Vargas did not put handcuffs on my son in front of 240 people. She walked him and Priscilla out through the service corridor, into a hallway beside the kitchen, with two detectives who had been sitting in a car in the parking garage since 7:15, and she read them their rights beside a rack of dirty dish trays. I did not see it. I stayed at the podium, because there were 240 people in that room, and the string quartet had stopped, and nobody knew what to do, and there was a cake on a cart by the door, with 50 on it in gold. So I stood at that microphone in my bad gray suit, and I did the last thing on my list. I said, "I'm sorry. This was not what any of you came here for." And then I said, "Please stay. There's a cake." And my wife would have been furious with all of us if it went to waste, and I would very much like to talk about her for a few minutes with people who knew her. And they stayed. Every one of them. 240 people stayed in that ballroom for another 2 hours, and Dorothy Kemp came up to the podium and told a story about Helen and a fourth-grade recorder concert in 1991 that had the entire room howling, and my neighbor, Ruth's boy Owen, ate 3 pieces of cake, and somebody put music on. And at some point in the middle of it, my daughter came and stood beside me at the head table, at the 8 empty chairs, and she took my hand, and neither of us said anything for a long time. And then Claire said, "You moved the whole party to the front of the room." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Look." And I looked. 240 people. All of them. Standing in a loose crowd at the front of the Fairmont Grand Ballroom, in front of the head table, under the banner, with my wife's name in gold letters, with paper plates in their hands. And at the back of the room, past the service doors, table 9 sat completely empty. I want to tell you what happened to everyone, and I am going to give you the actual numbers, because I have never in my life been able to tell a story without the actual numbers. The investigation took 11 months. It was not one case. That is the thing people do not understand. It became 4. Marcus Theodore Marsh, age 46. He pled guilty on the 2nd of March to 2 counts of theft from an endangered adult, a level 5 felony in Indiana, and 1 count of corrupt business influence. He was sentenced to 5 years in the Indiana Department of Correction, with 2 years suspended and 3 years of probation to follow. He will serve, with credit for time and good behavior, approximately 26 months. The court ordered restitution in the amount of $187,400. He will never sell commercial real estate in the state of Indiana again. His license was revoked on the 9th of April. He is not, and never will be, permitted to hold a fiduciary position, which means that if I lose my mind for real, actually, someday, the way men my age do, my son is the one person on this earth who is legally barred from being the one who decides what happens to me. I did not ask for that. That is simply what the statute does. Priscilla Ann Marsh, age 52, did not plead. She went to trial, in November, for 9 days, and I sat in the second row of that courtroom for every hour of it. She was charged with theft from an endangered adult, conspiracy to commit theft, and, because of Dorothy Vance, a second, separate count of exploitation of an endangered adult, and 1 count of perjury, arising from a sworn statement she filed in Hamilton County in 2022. The jury was out for 6 hours. She was convicted on all counts. She was sentenced to 11 years, with 3 suspended. She will serve approximately 7. I was in that courtroom when the verdict was read. I was 4 rows behind her, and she turned around, once, and she looked at me, and she still looked annoyed. 7 years, and she still looked at me like I was a load-bearing wall that had ruined her floor plan. Some people do not have the part that breaks. I do not know what to tell you about that. I have looked for it in her, and it is not there, and I have stopped looking. Dr. Wesley Pruitt, age 58. He is the one that matters. The Marion County Prosecutor's Office, the Indiana Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, and the State Medical Licensing Board opened a joint review of his 161 capacity evaluations. They have, as of this recording, reversed 9 guardianships. 9 people. 9 human beings who had been declared legally incapable of managing their own affairs, who could not sign a check, or refuse a pill, or decide where they slept, got their names back. One of them is a woman named Ada Vernon, who is 86, and who spent 19 months in a facility in Kokomo, and who is now living in her own house again in Sheridan, Indiana, with a cat. I have met her. She sent me a letter, in November, in handwriting that took her a very long time. She wrote, "They told me I was confused. I was not confused. I was outnumbered. I keep that letter in the drawer of my desk, on top of 211 case files, and I am going to keep it there for the rest of my life." Dr. Wesley Pruitt surrendered his medical license on the 22nd of June. He is under indictment on 14 counts. His trial is scheduled for spring, and I intend to be in the room. And the 4th case is the one that is still open, and it is the biggest one, and it is not mine. The Attorney General's office is now reviewing the entire guardianship pipeline in 4 counties: the physicians, the petitioners, the professional guardians, the facilities that accept residents on a guardian's signature, and the fee structures that let $118,000 evaporate out of an 81-year-old woman's house. Elena Cruz is a paid consultant on that review. She sent me an email in February. It said one line, "Mr. Marsh, you were right. It was never one building. Now, the money, the patent sold. I sold it in September to the same acquisition firm for $2.6 million, and I want to tell you exactly what happened to every dollar of it, because I promised you I would. $600,000 went to Claire, outright, immediately, with no conditions, and no trust and no strings. She tried to refuse it. She actually tried to refuse it, standing in my kitchen, on the same floor where her brother sat, and planned my institutionalization. And she said, "Dad, I don't want it to look like." And I said, "Claire, you slept in a recliner for 19 days and learned to run a morphine pump. You have never asked me for $1 in your life. Take the money." She took the money. She paid off her house, and she put the rest away, and she has not touched it. $490,000 went to the trust in Chicago, which pays out to me on a schedule I cannot alter, which is exactly how I want it, because I am 72 now, and I am not stupid about what is coming, for all of us eventually. $280,000 went to legal fees, Elena Cruz's invoices, and the 14 months of the investigation. I would pay it again tomorrow. And $1,230,000 went into something I set up in November with Frank Delgado, and which received its 501c3 determination letter on the 3rd of March. It is called the Helen Marsh Fund for Elder Legal Defense. It does exactly one thing. If you are over 65 and someone has filed a petition to have you declared incapacitated, and you cannot pay for a lawyer, because of course you cannot pay for a lawyer, that is the entire point. That is the trap. The moment they file, you cannot legally hire anyone. The Helen Marsh Fund pays for one. Independent counsel. An independent physician of your own choosing, not the petitioner's. And a forensic accountant, when the case needs one, which is more often than anybody would like. We have funded 41 defenses in the first 14 months. 28 of those petitions were withdrawn or denied. 28 people are still living in their own homes tonight because a music teacher from Marion County kept a ledger in pencil while she was dying. I chose the name deliberately, and I want to explain it, because people assume it is sentimental, and it is not. I did not name it after her, because she was my wife. I named it after her, because she was the investigator. I did not find it. Let me be very clear about that, because I have been given far too much credit for this, and I am going to correct the record right now. I found what they were doing to me. in the present tense, in a year when I was already looking. Helen found it first, alone, with no help, no training, no forensic accountant, no attorney, and no one to tell, in a room where she was dying, in handwriting that got worse every month, in pencil, on graph paper, for 26 months. She built the case that put her own son in prison. She just did not live long enough to file it. Every dollar in that fund is hers. I only carried the paper. There is one thing left, and it is the hardest one. And I have put it off for as long as I could. I go and see my son. The Plainfield Correctional Facility is a 51-minute drive from the house on Delaware Street. And visitation is on Saturday, and I go on the second Saturday of every month. I have not missed one. I want to tell you why, and I want to do it without pretending to be a better man than I am. It is not forgiveness. I want to be extremely clear about that. I have not forgiven Marcus, and I do not know if I am going to. And I have stopped promising myself a date by which I will have figured it out. It is not for him, either. I am not that generous. I go because of 11 seconds. On file 0508, at minute 39, my son was asked what was going to happen to me, and he did not answer for 11 seconds. Priscilla answered instantly. Every time, every single time, on 491 hours of tape, that woman answered instantly. Marcus took 11 seconds, and I have listened to those 11 seconds more times than I am willing to admit to you, on headphones, at my desk, in a house that is very quiet now. And here is what I hear in them. I hear a man arguing with himself, and losing. That is not innocence. I want to be so clear. He lost. He said okay, and he signed a witness line on his wife's aunt's guardianship 4 years earlier, and he took $187,000 from a woman who was dying, and there is no version of 11 seconds that gives that back. But it means something is still in there. It means the structure is damaged, badly, perhaps beyond repair. But it did not fully collapse, and I have spent my entire professional life being the man who is called in to determine, precisely and honestly and without sentiment, whether a damaged structure can be saved or whether it has to come down. And I have never once made that determination from the sidewalk. You have to go inside. You have to walk in, with a flashlight, into the building that everybody has already written off, and you have to put your hands on it. That is the job. That is the whole job. So on the second Saturday of every month, I drive 51 minutes to Plainfield, and I sit across a table from my son, and mostly, we do not say anything important. We have talked about the fishing trip 4 times. In February, he asked me about his mother's ledger. He asked me what her handwriting looked like on the last page, and I told him the truth, which is that it was very bad, and that it took her a long time, and that she wrote, "Tell him gently," because she was still, in the last weeks of her life, trying to protect the two of us from each other. He put his head down on the table in that visitation room, and he cried for about 4 minutes, and a guard came over, and I said we were fine, and when he sat back up, he said, "I don't know how to come back from this," and I said, "Neither do I. That's not the question." He said, "What's the question?" And I said, "The question is whether you're going to start." I have not offered him money. I have not offered him the house. He is not in my will, and he is not going to be. And he knows it, and I told him so, in that visitation room, in the second month, and he nodded, and he did not argue. He gets 51 minutes, and a table, and the truth. That is everything I have that is safe to give him. Some structures you can only inspect from a distance, for a very long time, before you find out whether they will hold anything at all. I am 72 years old. I still live in the house on Delaware Street. Claire wanted me to move, and I said no, and she has stopped asking. The maple tree in the backyard is 45 years old now, and it needs to be pruned, and I am going to pay somebody to do it, because I am 72, and I am not an idiot. Helen's shopping list is still on the refrigerator. It says milk, eggs, batteries. Call Ruth about Tuesday. It has been there for 3 years and 8 months. I still talk to her in the kitchen. I want to say that out loud, on this recording, deliberately. And I want to say it because for 14 months, my daughter-in-law was building a case that this was the proof I had lost my mind. I talk to my wife in our kitchen. I do it most mornings. I did it this morning. It is the sanest thing I do. Every Sunday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my daughter calls me. She has not missed one in 14 years. And every second Saturday, I drive to Plainfield. People ask me, and they do ask, more than you would think, because a version of this got into the newspapers, and then it got somewhere worse than the newspapers. They ask me how I sat at that table for 2 hours and 40 minutes. They ask how I ate cold chicken next to a booster seat, while 240 people I have known my whole life decided I was finished. And I tell them the same thing every time. I spent 38 years walking through buildings that everyone assumed were fine. The board would tell me it was fine. The developer would tell me it was fine. The architect would put his hand on a column and tell me, personally, that he had designed it and it was fine. And I would say, all right, show me the drawings. And I would go away, and I would come back in 11 months, and I would put a structure on a screen, in a federal courtroom, and take it apart, hairline crack by hairline crack, in a voice that never rose above conversational. They always underestimated me. Every single time. 142 cases, and not one of them ever saw it coming, and I have finally understood why. And it took my son putting me at a children's table to figure it out. They underestimated me because I let them. Because a quiet man in a bad suit gets shown things that a loud man never sees. Because they will tell the furniture anything. And because the old lion does not roar when he is hungry. He does it when he is finished. So here is what I know. At 72, standing in a kitchen in Indiana, talking to a woman who is not there. They will put you in the back of the room. They will hand you a paper cup and a place card with a number on it. And they will tell you it is because they ran out of chairs. Let them sit down, eat the chicken, count the empty seats at the head table, and write the number down, and wait. Because a man is not finished when they move him to the back of the room. He is finished when he agrees. That is where he belongs. I never agreed. They put me at table 9 at my own anniversary because they were absolutely certain I could no longer carry any load at all. But I spent my whole life doing failure analysis, and I will tell you the one thing I learned that they never bothered to. The structure does not fail where you put the weight. It fails where somebody stopped checking. They stopped checking me. I never stopped checking them. If any part of this story landed somewhere in your own life, if you have ever been moved to the back of a room by people who were counting on you being too tired to stand up, tell me in the comments. Someone else listening tonight needs to hear that they are not the only one. And if you'd like to sit with more stories like this one, subscribe to Old Lion Stories, and stay a while. The old lion is patient, but the file is always open.